My name is Seraphina Aniston, and I am 32 years old. 14 years ago, my father stood in our suburban kitchen, handed my older brother a $50,000 check for college tuition, and then threw a rusted shed key at my chest. He told me I lacked the brains for a real career. He told me to stick to cutting grass because I would always be a loser. He funded my brother's life and left me to bake in the July sun pushing a broken mower. Today, I am the sole owner and CEO of a commercial real estate firm in Chicago, valued at over $140 million. Last month, my father lost his entire pension in an offshore scam. Yesterday, his wrinkled resume landed on my polished obsidian desk. He applied for the night shift maintenance position at my corporate headquarters. He wants $18 an hour to scrub toilets and empty trash cans. He has no idea his loser daughter owns the building. Before I tell you what happened when I called my father into my executive suite for an interview, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. But only do it if this story truly resonates with you. Drop your age, where you are watching from, and your local time in the comments. I want to know who is listening. Now let me take you back 14 years to a humid Tuesday morning in Illinois, to the exact moment my father decided my future was worthless. The air in our kitchen felt thick. My father, Thomas Aniston, stood at the head of the breakfast table, wearing his crisp gray suit, exuding an unearned sense of authority. Across from him sat my older brother, Kyle. Kyle had barely scraped by in high school, spending more time at parties than opening a textbook. But in my father's eyes, Kyle could do no wrong. Kyle was the golden child. I stood by the sink in faded jeans and a second-hand shirt, washing the breakfast dishes. I had just graduated high school, too. I had dreams of studying business. I had brochures from state colleges sitting on the counter. My father reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his leather checkbook. He smoothed it flat on the table. With a heavy, deliberate hand, he scrawled a series of numbers. He tore the slip free. The crisp sound of the paper tearing echoed in the quiet room. He slid the check across the table to Kyle. $50,000. Out-of-state tuition for a private university. "Make us proud, son," my father said, clapping Kyle on the shoulder. Kyle folded the check, tucked it into his wallet, and smirked. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and stepped forward. I looked at the college brochures on the counter, then at my father. I asked him how we were going to handle my tuition. My father stopped smiling. His eyes hardened into cold chips of flint. He reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a checkbook for me. Instead, he pulled out a single, jagged key attached to a faded yellow plastic tag. He tossed it. It hit the granite counter with a sharp, dismissive clatter. The key to the backyard shed. "You do not have the brains for a real career, Seraphina," he sneered, his voice dripping with casual disdain. "You struggle with basic math. You lack ambition. Stick to cutting grass. You will always be a loser. At least try to be a useful one." The words felt like a physical strike. I looked at my mother, Helen. She stood at the stove, her back turned, stirring a pan of scrambled eggs she suddenly found fascinating. She said nothing. She let him erase my future. I picked up the key. The metal felt cold against my palm. I did not argue. I learned very early that arguing with a narcissist is a losing game. The only way to win is to outbuild them in silence. I walked out the back door, unlocked the shed, and pulled out the sputtering push mower. I spent the next 4 years bleeding blistered hands into the dirt of the wealthiest estates in the North Shore. I did not just cut grass. I studied the acreage. I learned zoning laws, property valuations, and the quiet, lethal language of leverage. That rusted lawnmower was the first vehicle of my empire. And yesterday, sitting in my corner office overlooking the skyline, I held the resume of the man who handed me that key. He needed a job. I reached for my intercom and told my assistant to call Thomas Aniston and bring him in for an interview. Before I tell you what happened when my father walked into my executive suite, you have to understand the suffocating reality of the Aniston household. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, you know the exact dynamic I am talking about. You know the feeling of working yourself to the bone, only to watch someone else receive the applause just for breathing. My older brother Kyle was the undisputed golden child. He coasted through life on a cushion of endless excuses provided by my parents. The contrast between our lives became painfully clear the day I turned 18. There was no cake. There was no celebration. I walked downstairs at 6 a.m, tying my work boots, preparing for a 12-hour landscaping shift. My father sat at the kitchen table drinking his coffee. He slid a piece of paper toward me. It was an itemized bill for room and board. He demanded 30% of my weekly landscaping income. He told me adults pay their own way, and I needed to learn responsibility. 3 weeks later, Kyle finished his freshman year of college. He came home with a failing grade point average and academic probation. My father did not hand him a bill. Instead, my father took him to a luxury car dealership and co-signed a loan for a silver BMW. My father said Kyle needed a reliable vehicle to attend networking events and build his future. Kyle spent that summer sleeping until noon and driving to fraternity parties on my father's dime. I spent that summer baking in the unforgiving Illinois heat. I pushed that sputtering, rusted push mower across the sprawling, immaculate lawns of the North Shore. My hands were permanently calloused. My boots were stained green. But I refused to let the manual labor break my spirit. I used the isolation to my advantage. I paid strict attention to the wealth surrounding me. While trimming hedges, I listened to general contractors discuss supply costs and profit margins. While edging driveways, I analyzed property lines and zoning permits. I noticed which houses sat on the market for months and which ones sold in a week. I kept a small spiral notebook tucked into the back pocket of my denim shorts. The pages were smeared with dirt and sweat, but they were filled with numbers. I ran amortization schedules. I calculated capitalization rates. I practiced the complex math my father swore I could never comprehend. That was how I met Vivian Sterling. Vivian Sterling was a legend in Chicago real estate. She was a self-made commercial developer who clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated industry in the 1980s. She owned a sprawling stone estate in Winnetka. Her landscaping contract was the most lucrative account my boss held. Every Tuesday, I spent 4 hours maintaining her pristine grounds. She intimidated everyone. She demanded perfection and rarely spoke to the hired help. One sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late August, the heat index hit 100 degrees. I was supposed to be weeding the hydrangeas near her stone patio, but I had found a discarded business section of the Chicago Tribune sitting on a patio chair. The front page featured a commercial foreclosure listing. It was an abandoned strip mall on the edge of a developing suburb. I forgot about the hydrangeas. I pulled out my dirt-stained notebook and started calculating the numbers. I knew the area well because I mowed lawns there. I knew the city was planning to expand a major highway straight past that lot. The asking price was shockingly low. "What are you doing?" The voice cracked like a whip behind me. I jumped, dropping my pencil. Vivian Sterling stood on the patio, wearing a tailored silk suit, holding a crystal glass of iced water. Her sharp eyes darted from the unweeded flower beds to the newspaper in my dirty hands. My heart hammered against my ribs. I thought she would fire my boss immediately. I thought my job was over. I scrambled to my feet and apologized. I reached for my trowel, ready to return to the dirt. Vivian stepped forward and placed her manicured hand flat on the newspaper, stopping me. She looked at the frantic math scribbled in my notebook. She looked back at my face. "I asked you a question, Seraphina," she said, her tone unreadable. "What are you looking at?" I swallowed hard. I decided to tell the truth. I pointed a dirt-stained finger at the foreclosure listing. I told her the bank had mispriced the asset. I explained the upcoming municipal highway expansion. I told her the traffic flow would triple in 2 years, turning a dead strip mall into a highly profitable retail hub. I quoted the exact price per square foot and the estimated cost of a gut renovation. Vivian Sterling stared at me for a long, terrifying minute. The silence stretched tight. Then the sharp lines of her face softened into a slow, calculating smile. She did not fire me. She turned around, walked into her expansive kitchen, and returned a moment later carrying 2 tall glasses of fresh lemonade. She handed one to me. A landscaper covered in mud and sweat standing on her pristine patio. "Sit down," Vivian commanded, pointing to a wrought iron chair. "Walk me through your cap rate calculations again." In a single afternoon, the trajectory of my life shifted. Vivian Sterling saw the raw hunger in my eyes. She saw the sharp mind my father had tried to bury under a mountain of insults. She became the mentor my parents refused to be. She started leaving old contracts, financial reports, and market analyses on the patio table for me to study. She taught me the quiet, lethal language of leverage while I pruned her roses. I felt a new sense of power growing inside me. But back at the Aniston household, the toxicity was reaching a breaking point. 2 months after my first lesson with Vivian, the phone rang at 3 a.m. I woke up to the sound of my mother crying and my father shouting. Kyle had wrapped his silver BMW around a concrete street lamp. He was driving under the influence. He was unharmed, but the car was totaled, and he was sitting in a holding cell at the local police station. My parents rushed out the door. They drained their savings to bail him out. They hired a premium defense attorney to sweep the charges under the rug. They treated Kyle like a victim of circumstance instead of a reckless adult. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table eating a bowl of cheap cereal before my shift. My father walked in, looking exhausted and furious. He glared at me, his face twisted with misplaced rage. "This is your fault," he snapped, his voice sharp and bitter. I froze my spoon halfway to my mouth. I asked him how a drunk driving accident miles away could possibly be my fault. "If you had just lent your brother your work truck last night, he would not have taken the BMW," my father reasoned, his logic twisted by blind favoritism. "You know he gets nervous driving that nice car. You stress him out, Seraphina. You are so selfish. You only ever think about yourself." I stared at him. The sheer irrationality of his blame took my breath away. He was willing to twist reality into an unrecognizable knot just to protect Kyle and punish me. My mother walked into the kitchen. She heard every word. She poured a cup of coffee, looked right through me, and asked my father if Kyle needed a special breakfast to calm his nerves. The injustice was suffocating. It sat heavy on my chest, threatening to crush me. But as I looked at my parents catering to a son who was actively destroying his own life, the heavy weight suddenly lifted. I realized I could never win their love. I could never earn their respect. No matter how hard I worked, I would always be the scapegoat. The realization did not break me. It freed me. The tether connecting me to their toxic approval snapped. I stood up, rinsed my bowl in the sink, and walked out the back door without saying a word. I went to work. I pushed my rusty mower. I studied the real estate market with a renewed, ferocious intensity. My escape plan was no longer a vague dream. It was a strict timeline. I knew I needed capital to make my first move. I needed to build my armor in silence while they celebrated their golden child. The real test of my determination was rapidly approaching, and my father's blind loyalty to Kyle was about to hand me the perfect opportunity. Under Vivian Sterling's sharp tutelage, my daily lawn care hustle morphed into a rigorous masterclass in market analysis. I still showed up every Tuesday morning to edge her pristine driveways and weed her sprawling flower beds. But the real education began the moment the mower engine cut off. We sat on her shaded stone patio, surrounded by acres of manicured wealth, analyzing dense property records. She taught me how to read municipal zoning maps with the precision of a surgeon. She showed me how to spot desperate sellers by identifying distinct patterns in public tax defaults. She did not coddle me. She demanded flawlessness. If I miscalculated a capitalization rate by a fraction of a percent, she dumped my paperwork into the recycling bin and told me to start over. She forced me to defend my investment thesis until my logic was bulletproof. She treated me like an intellectual equal, which was a profound respect my own parents never bothered to offer. I hoarded every single penny I earned from my landscaping roots. I stopped buying new clothes. I wore the same fraying denim jeans and heavy work boots every day. I ate generic peanut butter sandwiches for lunch, sitting alone on the rusted tailgate of my work truck. My bank account slowly grew, but I knew better than to leave the funds where my father could stumble upon a mailed paper statement. Thomas possessed an uncanny ability to sniff out anything he could claim as his own. Instead, I went to a local thrift store and bought a dozen thick, hardcover encyclopedias. I took a sharp box cutter and painstakingly hollowed out the centers of the heavy pages. Night after night, I rolled crisp $100 bills into tight uniform bundles and stuffed them into those hidden paper compartments. The smell of old dust and fresh ink became the scent of my secret independence. To my family, I was just a naive, dull girl keeping dusty, useless books on a bedroom shelf. They thought I was hoarding garbage. In reality, I was building an impenetrable fortress. My father never missed a single opportunity to remind me of my perceived place in his world. One humid evening, he walked past my open bedroom door. I was sitting on my faded rug, surrounded by highlighted amortization schedules and county tax printouts. I was trying to memorize complex commercial loan structures. He leaned against the wooden door frame holding a cold beer. A condescending sneer stretched across his face. He looked down at my scattered papers and let out a booming, cruel laugh. "Do not strain yourself, Seraphina," he mocked, shaking his head. "You can barely do basic math without using your fingers. Stop playing business. Just make sure the lines on the neighbor's lawn are straight tomorrow. They pay you to sweat, not to think." I swallowed the bitter lump forming in my throat. My chest tightened, but I forced a polite blank smile and nodded. I learned very early that arguing with a narcissist is a highly dangerous game. The only way to win is to outbuild them in total silence. I packed up my papers right in front of him, pretending to concede defeat. He walked away satisfied, taking a long pull from his bottle. He had no idea I had just identified a lucrative commercial loophole he would never even possess the capacity to comprehend. By the time I turned 20, I had secretly saved $35,000. It was blood money, earned through blistering heat, calloused hands, and sheer, unbroken defiance. I packed my hollowed-out encyclopedias into a duffel bag and took them straight to Vivian. We dumped the rolled cash onto her polished mahogany dining table. She did not smile, but her sharp, discerning eyes gleamed with undeniable respect. "You are ready," she said simply. We targeted a dilapidated foreclosed duplex on the grimier industrial edge of the city. The roof was visibly sagging. The yard was a wild, untamed jungle of thorny weeds. The bank wanted the liability gone. I had the down payment, but I lacked the extensive credit history required to secure the commercial loan. Vivian stepped in as a silent partner, co-signing the thick stack of bank paperwork without a second of hesitation. We closed the deal on a rainy Thursday morning. I held the deed in my dirt-stained hands, feeling a surge of raw electricity course through my veins. I was officially a landlord, generating passive income. I owned real estate. But I could never let my parents know the truth. If Thomas found out, he would find a twisted justification to take credit, or worse, he would demand a share of the equity to fund Kyle. So I lived a grueling, exhausting double life. During the day, I pushed the mower and trimmed the hedges, playing the part of the unambitious, obedient landscaper. At night, I drove my truck to my hidden duplex. I patched crumbling drywall under the dim orange glow of a single halogen work light. I watched internet tutorials on basic plumbing and fixed leaking copper pipes at 2 a.m. so my parents would not notice my late absence. I breathed in toxic dust and fumes. I painted the walls, laid down cheap laminate flooring, and eventually rented out the second unit to a quiet young couple. I moved my own sparse belongings into the bottom unit, claiming to my parents I was just renting a cheap room from a strict, unforgiving landlord. The physical toll was bone-crushing. My muscles ached constantly. I lived on black coffee and sheer adrenaline. Yet, at our mandated Sunday family dinners, I remained the silent disappointment. I sat at the dining room table pushing dry roast beef around my plate, listening to my parents endlessly brag about Kyle. Kyle was preparing to graduate with a useless communications degree. He had no job offers. He had no professional prospects. He spent his weekends partying and his weekdays sleeping until noon. But Thomas and Helen spoke about him as if he were a visionary genius, poised to conquer the global corporate world. I chewed my food in silence, knowing my secret asset was quietly generating revenue across town. The secret was my ultimate armor, keeping their toxic words from piercing my heart. I let them construct their fragile delusions. But the ultimate test of my restraint was rapidly approaching. Kyle was preparing to cross a college graduation stage, and my father was preparing to make a financial decision that would shatter our family forever. Thomas was blinded by an unyielding loyalty to a son who only knew how to take. That reckless loyalty was about to cost my father everything he owned. Kyle celebrated his college graduation on a humid Friday evening in late May. The venue chosen for this grand occasion was an exclusive downtown Chicago steakhouse. The restaurant was a temple of American excess, featuring dark mahogany paneled walls, sweeping leather booths, and the heavy scent of charred prime rib mingling with expensive cologne. My parents spared no expense to honor their golden child. They ordered towering seafood platters and bottles of overpriced Cabernet Sauvignon that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I sat at the far end of the long, polished table, wearing a simple black dress I bought on clearance. My hands rested in my lap. Even scrubbed clean, my knuckles bore the faint, permanent calluses of manual labor. I felt entirely out of place among the clinking crystal glasses and the boisterous laughter. Yet my mind remained razor-sharp, calculating the exorbitant cost of the meal. The price of this single dinner could have easily covered the emergency plumbing repairs at my hidden duplex. But Thomas and Helen Aniston lived in a state of perpetual financial denial. They believed projecting wealth was identical to possessing it. Kyle sat at the center of attention, wearing a custom-tailored suit funded entirely by my father. He had barely scraped together enough credits to secure a useless communications degree. He possessed zero internship experience. He lacked a single job offer. Yet he leaned back in his leather chair, sipping a generic scotch, acting like a conquering hero returning from battle. Helen doted on him endlessly, wiping non-existent specks of dust from his lapel. She praised his resilience for surviving the grueling demands of fraternity life. I remained silent, pushing a small portion of asparagus around my porcelain plate. I knew a dangerous secret. A week prior, I had entered our suburban kitchen early in the morning and found a glossy presentation folder discarded on the granite island. The cover read, Synergy Tech Solutions. It was Kyle's grand business plan. Driven by the rigorous analytical curiosity Vivian Sterling instilled in me, I opened the folder. I expected a structured strategy. Instead, I found 40 pages of sheer financial fiction. The document was a disorganized, chaotic jumble of Silicon Valley buzzwords. There were no user acquisition cost breakdowns. There were zero competitive market analyses. His projected revenue streams were based on absurd, impossible assumptions that defied basic arithmetic. Vivian would have shredded the document within 30 seconds and fired the person who dared to submit it. Kyle wanted to build a revolutionary social networking application, but he lacked a single line of code, a solitary developer, or a coherent monetization strategy. It was a guaranteed sinkhole for capital. The dinner progressed through decadent courses. Thomas ordered another round of drinks. The table buzzed with celebratory energy. Then, My father picked up his heavy silver fork and clinked it against his crystal wine glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the crowded restaurant. The table fell into a hushed, expectant silence. Thomas stood up, straightening his designer tie. His chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He looked down at his son with an expression of profound adoration he had never once directed toward me. "Tonight, we celebrate the future," my father announced, his voice carrying that booming, authoritative tone he utilized in middle management meetings. "Kyle has proven his brilliance by conquering his university studies, but a true visionary cannot be confined to a standard entry-level cubicle. A visionary requires capital to launch his empire." A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I knew exactly where this speech was heading. "Therefore," Thomas continued, beaming with self-satisfaction, "I am thrilled to announce my formal investment in Synergy Tech Solutions. Yesterday morning, I finalized the paperwork to extract a second mortgage on our family home. I am providing Kyle with $200,000 in seed funding to bring his brilliant application to the global market." Helen gasped in delight, clapping her hands together. Kyle offered a smug, practiced smile, raising his glass in a silent salute to his primary investor. The sheer magnitude of the financial catastrophe hit me like a physical blow. $200,000. My father was leveraging his primary residence, his ultimate safety net, on a business plan that lacked a single realistic metric. He was tying a concrete block to his ankles and gleefully jumping into a deep ocean. I could not remain silent. Despite the years of emotional neglect, despite the endless cruelty, a tiny residual shred of familial duty compelled me to speak. I wanted to save them from total ruin. "Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The celebratory atmosphere instantly evaporated. Thomas slowly turned his head to look at me. His smile vanished, replaced by a rigid mask of irritation. "The numbers in that business plan do not align." I continued keeping my tone level and analytical. I read the proposal on the kitchen counter. The projected burn rate will exhaust that $200,000 in less than 6 months. There is no viable path to profitability. You cannot risk the equity of your home on an unproven concept. The silence that followed was suffocating. Diners at adjacent tables briefly glanced over, sensing the sudden hostile shift in temperature. Kyle let out a sharp, mocking scoff. He shook his head, staring at me with pure disdain. "You read my prospectus, Seraphina," he sneered. "What could you possibly understand about tech startups? You spend your days pulling weeds." I ignored him, maintaining eye contact with my father. "Dad, please, have an independent financial advisor review the documents before the funds clear. It is a mathematical impossibility." The veins in my father's neck bulged against his white collar. His face turned a deep, mottled shade of crimson. He reached down and grabbed his silver steak knife, pointing the serrated edge directly at my chest. "How dare you?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper that carried across the expensive linen tablecloth. "How dare you sit at my table, eating the food I purchased, and insult your brother's genius?" I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still, analyzing the fragile ego unraveling before my eyes. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter girl," Thomas continued, his words designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. "You possess no ambition. You lack the intellect to comprehend high-level corporate strategy. Kyle is a visionary. You cut grass for a living. You play in the dirt. Keep your mouth shut and stick to the only thing you are good at." I looked at Helen, hoping for a single, solitary intervention. My mother picked up her linen napkin, avoiding my gaze entirely. She wiped her mouth, pretending the confrontation was not happening. She chose her golden child. She chose the comfortable delusion over the harsh reality. In that precise defining moment, the final invisible thread tying me to the Aniston family disintegrated. I felt no sorrow. I felt no rage. I only experienced a profound, chilling clarity. I realized I was trying to rescue passengers on a sinking ship who were actively drilling holes in the hull. I owed them nothing. Their financial suicide was their own orchestrated choice. I slowly stood up from the leather booth. I smoothed the wrinkles from my cheap black dress. The motion was calm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. I reached into my small clutch purse. I pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I placed it gently on the white tablecloth right next to my half-empty glass of tap water. "That covers my portion," I stated, my voice hollow and cold. Thomas glared at me, his jaw clenched tight. "Where do you think you are going?" he demanded, trying to reassert his broken authority. "Sit down." I did not answer him. I did not offer a dramatic parting speech. I simply turned my back on the table and walked away. My heels clicked a steady, rhythmic cadence against the hardwood floor of the restaurant. I pushed through the heavy, brass-trimmed glass doors and stepped out into the cool evening air of downtown Chicago. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The suffocating weight of their expectations lifted from my shoulders forever. I walked straight to the nearest subway station. I returned to their suburban house, packed my sparse belongings into trash bags, and loaded them into the bed of my rusted work truck. I drove across the city to my hidden duplex. I unlocked the door to my own property, turned on the single halogen work light, and sat on the bare floorboards. I was entirely alone, but I was finally, truly free. I officially moved out, leaving Thomas and Helen to bask in their delusion. I left them to face the catastrophic consequences of their blind loyalty. I retreated into the shadows to build my empire, while they unknowingly set the countdown to their own spectacular downfall. Fast forward 7 years. The passage of time was not marked by birthdays or holidays or joyful family gatherings. My timeline was measured in building permits, zoning approvals, and pouring concrete. I lived in the bottom unit of that dilapidated duplex for 2 grueling years. I replaced the corroded plumbing, patched the sagging roof, and painted every square inch of drywall myself. I worked until my muscles burned and my hands bled. When I finally sold the renovated property, the profit margin exceeded my most optimistic projections. I took that capital and funneled it straight into the abandoned strip mall Vivian and I had analyzed on her stone patio. The municipality approved the highway expansion exactly as I had predicted. The heavy machinery rolled in, and the traffic patterns shifted. Within 18 months, that dead, neglected retail space transformed into a thriving commercial hub. I secured long-term leases with premium corporate tenants. I refinanced the property, extracted the equity, and set my sights firmly on the downtown skyline. I formally incorporated my enterprise. I named the company Aniston and Sterling Holdings. It was a quiet, silent tribute to the only woman who recognized my intellect before I possessed the bank account to prove it. Building an empire in the shadows requires a punishing level of discipline. I routinely worked 80-hour weeks. I skipped vacations. I ignored social invitations. I wore generic, unbranded blazers from discount racks so I could afford to retain top-tier corporate attorneys. My legal counsel wore bespoke Italian suits while I ate day-old sandwiches at my desk, reviewing thick stacks of amortization schedules. I understood the assignment clearly. True wealth is not what you show the world. True wealth is the barrier you build to insulate yourself from it. I maintained a strict physical and emotional distance from my toxic bloodline, yet the catastrophic details of their unraveling still reached my ears. Gossip remains the primary currency of suburban relatives. My maternal aunt called me one crisp autumn morning, eager to share the unfolding disaster taking place in my childhood home. The $200,000 second mortgage Thomas extracted for Synergy Tech Solutions evaporated in record time. Kyle did not hire a single software developer. He did not write a solitary line of code. Instead, he leased a premium downtown office space he could not afford. He purchased custom ergonomic furniture, imported espresso machines, and threw lavish networking parties featuring top-shelf liquor. He played the role of a successful tech founder without producing a single tangible product. The startup imploded in less than 8 months, leaving behind a messy trail of unpaid vendors, broken lease agreements, and furious creditors. The seed money was gone. Thomas could have accepted the loss. He could have admitted his golden child was a fraud. He could have cut his losses, scaled back his lifestyle, and spent the remaining years of his career paying off the crippling debt. But narcissism demands a constant, fierce defense of its own delusions. Thomas needed to prove he was right. He needed a financial miracle to replenish his drained home equity. Kyle, ever the opportunist, introduced a new lifeline to his desperate father. He pitched an offshore cryptocurrency investment fund, promising astronomical guaranteed returns. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, wrapped in unregulated digital jargon and flashy online brochures. Desperation makes otherwise functional people do remarkably foolish things. Thomas, driven by the sheer terror of impending bankruptcy, liquidated his entire corporate pension. He cashed out the safety net he had spent 3 decades building. He wired those funds to an anonymous overseas account, hoping to double his money overnight and save face. The offshore fund vanished without a trace. The website returned a static error message. The phone numbers disconnected. Decades of steady corporate employment and decades of savings were wiped out in a single keystroke. Thomas was left holding nothing but worthless digital tokens and a crushing second mortgage he could no longer service. The walls were closing in on the Aniston family. I learned the grim finality of their situation on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in a sterile, glass-walled conference room, reviewing the structural blueprints for a massive new acquisition, when my personal cell phone illuminated. The caller identification displayed my mother's number. Helen had not dialed my phone in 5 long years. I set down my pen. I watched the screen flash until the call went straight to voicemail. 10 minutes later, I pressed the speaker icon and listened to the audio file. Her voice trembled, echoing with raw, unrestrained panic. "Seraphina, please pick up the phone," Helen begged, her words stumbling over one another in a frantic rush. "We are in terrible trouble. Your father made a bad investment. The bank is sending threatening letters about the house. They are going to take it. We need a small loan, just $100,000 to keep them away. You are our daughter. You have to help us. Please call me back." The audio file ended. The silence in my conference room felt profound and heavy. 5 years of total silence. 5 years of treating me like a disposable burden, a landscaping peasant who embarrassed their pristine image. And the exact moment their fabricated reality collapsed, they expected me to play the role of their savior. They wanted the daughter who pushed the rusted lawnmower to fund the lifestyle they squandered on the son who did nothing but take. I did not feel a single trace of guilt. I felt a chilling, impenetrable resolve. You cannot rescue individuals who are deeply committed to their own destruction. Throwing a life preserver to a drowning person who refuses to swim will only pull you under the freezing water with them. I pressed the delete button on the screen. I erased the voicemail. I permanently blocked her number from my device, ensuring she could never disrupt my peace again. I gathered my blueprints and walked out of the conference room. I was scheduled to tour my latest and most ambitious project. I drove my sleek black sedan to the city center and stepped into the open-air construction elevator of a skeletal high-rise. The steel cage groaned as it lifted me 40 stories above the bustling Chicago streets. The cool wind whipped my hair as I stepped onto the unfinished concrete floor of the penthouse level. I was mere hours away from signing the closing documents on this flagship corporate tower. The horizon stretched out before me, vast and full of limitless potential. I was standing at the very peak of my industry. Meanwhile, miles away in the quiet suburbs, the final domino of the Aniston family legacy tipped over. The inevitable crash was coming. The bank was circling their front door. I had secured the perfect vantage point to watch the dust settle. The digital ledger displaying my father's supposed fortune dropped to to zero. 6 figures of hard-earned corporate retirement funds vaporized into the digital ether. Thomas Aniston spent 30 long years climbing the tedious middle management ladder at a regional logistics firm. He wore stiff starched shirts and polished leather Oxfords. He built his entire persona around being the undisputed provider, the authoritative patriarch, the smartest man in any room. He judged every individual he met by the balance in their bank accounts. He judged his own daughter by her dirt-stained boots and calloused hands. At 62 years old, that arrogant protective shell shattered into unrecoverable pieces. The authentic bank statements arrived via certified mail, bearing bold red text: delinquent, default, foreclosure pending. The financial institution holding the deed to his home did not care about his past managerial titles. The loan officers only cared about the missing monthly payments. Thomas was left holding nothing but a worthless tech startup prospectus and a hollow, echoing void where his pride used to reside. When the structural walls of their financial security crumbled, you would normally expect the favored golden child to step forward and offer a steady hand. You would naturally assume the son who received $50,000 in college tuition and $200,000 in seed money would rush to rescue his desperate aging parents. Kyle did the exact opposite. The precise moment the relentless collection agencies started calling the suburban landline, my brother packed his designer wardrobe into his expensive luxury luggage. He did not offer a tearful, heartfelt goodbye. He did not vow to repay the astronomical debt he single-handedly created. He simply packed his bags and vanished into the night. Gossip filtered through the distant family grapevine, revealing he fled across state lines to a sunny coastal city. Helen left dozens of frantic, desperate voicemails, pleading with him to return and fix the disaster. The automated carrier response eventually informed her the number was no longer in service. Kyle changed his contact information to dodge furious creditors. He abandoned Thomas and Helen to face the catastrophic consequences of their blind favoritism entirely alone. They nurtured a selfish parasite for decades and feigned shock when it finally drained them dry. 2 months after the bank initiated formal legal proceedings, I found myself driving through my old suburban neighborhood. A cold, bitter November rain washed the quiet, winding streets. The towering oak trees stood bare against the heavy gray sky. I steered my sleek black sedan down the familiar curving road and parked directly across from the 2-story colonial house where I grew up. The pristine, manicured lawn I once maintained with military precision was now terribly overgrown and tangled. Thorny weeds choked the pristine flower beds I used to weed by hand. Hammered deep into the front yard, right in the exact spot where I used to push that sputtering rusted mower, stood a garish neon sign. Bank owned, property of Chase Financial, auction pending. I sat in the heated leather seat of my luxury vehicle, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at that wooden stake. I truly expected to feel a sudden surge of vindictive, triumphant joy. Instead, a profound wave of clinical, cold pity washed over my chest. They traded their secure, comfortable future for a temporary, fleeting illusion of grandeur. They bet every single asset they possessed on the wrong child. But intermingled with that pity was an undeniable, chilling sense of validation. The universe possesses a remarkable, poetic way of balancing the scales. The daughter they banished to the backyard shed was now returning as the silent architect of their new reality. I picked up my phone and dialed my lead acquisitions director. I gave him a very specific, strict set of instructions. We bypassed the chaotic public auction entirely. I utilized a holding corporation named Cobalt Horizon Enterprises. It was a blind legal entity I established years prior to shield my personal identity from high-profile commercial purchases. My signature would never appear on the public county property records. Within 48 hours, my legal team finalized the complex transaction. The bank transferred the distressed asset deed directly to my holding company. I became the sole legal owner of the exact property where I was once treated like an indentured servant. I held the deed to the kingdom they exiled me from. The swift, brutal gears of the legal system turned without an ounce of mercy. Cobalt Horizon Enterprises issued the standard 30-day notice to vacate the premises. Thomas and Helen received the certified letter demanding they leave the property immediately. They possessed zero financial resources to hire a defense attorney. They held zero leverage to negotiate a delayed departure date. The proud suburban patriarch and his complacent wife were forced to pack their remaining meager possessions into rented cardboard boxes. They relocated to a cramped, depressing one-bedroom apartment situated on the grimy industrial outskirts of the city. Their new living room window offered a bleak view of a chain-link fence and a loud concrete recycling facility. The contrast to their former sprawling suburban life was staggering and steep. The loss of the house was only the grim beginning of their grueling ordeal. Rent in that dingy complex still required a prompt monthly check. Groceries required actual cash. The utility companies demanded timely payment to keep the heat running. Thomas Aniston, former logistics manager, needed to generate immediate income. But the modern corporate world is exceptionally cruel to executives who age out of the system without adaptable tech skills. His outdated paper resume held zero value in a digital economy. Automated algorithms rejected his applications for desk jobs before human eyes ever saw them. He attended interviews where hiring managers half his age looked at his gray hair with polite, unhelpful pity. He was forced to confront a terrifying, harsh reality. The man who mocked manual labor, the man who told me to stick to dirt, now had to seek out entry-level physical work just to keep the lights turned on. Desperation strips away the luxury of human pride. Thomas swallowed his remaining dignity and began searching for positions he would have openly ridiculed a decade prior. He needed a role that required no advanced degrees, no software proficiency, and no prior industry experience. He needed a basic uniform and a predictable hourly wage. He scoured the local classifieds and online job boards, submitting inquiries for night stockroom shifts, delivery routes, and custodial services. He cast a wide, desperate net, hoping someone would overlook his age and grant him a simple lifeline. The tragic irony of his situation was rich and poetic. The universe was quietly preparing to deliver a brutal lesson in humility straight to his doorstep. Because one of those desperate scattered applications found its way out of the vast digital ether. It bypassed the standard human resources filters and landed directly on the polished obsidian desk of my Chicago penthouse office. The stage was set for a quiet, devastating reunion he never saw coming. Which brings us right back to the present moment. I sat in my penthouse office holding my father's crinkled resume. The timeline of his spectacular downfall had finally intersected with the timeline of my quiet ascent. The piece of paper resting on my polished obsidian desk felt heavy with poetic justice. I examined the document closely. It was printed on cheap, low-grade copy paper. The ink was slightly faded, indicating he likely used a public library printer to generate it. The formatting was outdated and rigid. He attempted to list his previous managerial duties utilizing inflated corporate jargon, trying desperately to make a desk job sound relevant to facility maintenance. He highlighted his punctuality, his team leadership, and his attention to detail. He listed obsolete software proficiencies that held zero value in the modern economy. The sheer desperation leaked through the standard Times New Roman font. The requisition number he applied for was 409, night shift custodian. The operating hours were 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. I knew the specific duties attached to that role because I personally approved the facility management budget. The responsibilities included operating heavy industrial floor buffers, scrubbing porcelain restroom fixtures, emptying biohazard disposal bins, and policing the concrete parking garage for discarded debris. He would be required to wear a standard-issue blue canvas uniform. He would be on his feet for 8 solid hours. His aging knees would ache. His lower back would scream in protest. He would be forced to handle harsh industrial cleaning chemicals that would strip the skin from his hands. He would become a silent, invisible ghost, haunting the gleaming corridors of power he once believed he rightfully deserved to occupy. The irony was rich and undeniable. He told me to stick to dirt. He told me manual labor was the only path suitable for a girl lacking intellect. Now he was practically begging for the opportunity to sweep the dirt from my floors. He was praying the anonymous corporate machine would grant him the privilege of pushing a mop just to keep a roof over his head. Before I detail the precise trap I set for him, I want to pause. I want to ask you a direct question. If you sat in my tailored suit, holding the ultimate fate of the man who degraded and humiliated you for decades, what is your next move? Do you shred the paper and let him starve on the street? Do you call building security and ban him from the premises permanently? Do you hire him merely to crush his spirit on a daily basis? Drop your honest answer in the comments right now. I guarantee my final decision will divide this audience. I stared at that single sheet of paper for a full, uninterrupted hour. The wounded teenager living deep inside my chest wanted to destroy him. She wanted to frame his foreclosure notice and mail it to his dingy apartment. She wanted to stand in the lobby and laugh as he was escorted off the property. But the chief executive officer knew better. I remembered a distinct conversation with my mentor, Vivian Sterling. We were finalizing a hostile corporate takeover of a rival firm years ago. The opposing owner had spent months planting false rumors about our liquidity in the financial press, attempting to ruin our reputation. When we finally acquired his company and held his professional fate in our hands, I asked Vivian if she felt a satisfying sense of vengeance. Vivian poured a glass of sparkling water, walked to her window, and shook her head. "Business is never about revenge, Seraphina," she told me, her voice smooth and calculating. "Revenge is a heated, messy emotion. It clouds your judgment. It makes you sloppy. Business is solely about leverage. Leverage is a cold mathematical equation. You do not destroy your enemies by burning them to the ground. You purchase their debt, you acquire their assets, and you put them to work for your own profit." I took a deep breath, letting her wisdom anchor my racing thoughts. I did not want to be the villain in his fabricated narrative. I did not want to give him a reason to claim I was a cruel, ungrateful daughter. I wanted to be the harsh, undeniable reality check he spent a lifetime avoiding. I reached across my desk and pressed the silver intercom button. I called my director of human resources, Marcus, into my office. Marcus was a sharp, meticulous professional who managed a diverse workforce of 400 employees. He was accustomed to dealing with complex labor laws and executive compensation packages. He stepped into my office holding a digital tablet, expecting a high-level discussion regarding our upcoming quarterly hiring projections. Instead, I handed him the cheap piece of copy paper. I instructed Marcus to process Thomas Aniston for the night shift maintenance position. Marcus frowned, looking down at the unimpressive resume. He asked why the chief executive officer was personally reviewing an entry-level custodial application. He noted the candidate possessed zero relevant experience in commercial facility maintenance and was far older than our typical applicant for heavy physical labor. I maintained a perfect poker face. I told Marcus it was a special case requiring his direct and immediate oversight. I instructed him to conduct the standard preliminary background checks, verify the limited references, and ensure the applicant met all basic physical health requirements for the grueling shifts. Then I delivered my strict, non-negotiable conditions. Thomas Aniston must never hear the surname Aniston during the entire hiring process. My identity must be entirely redacted from all orientation materials provided to him. The corporate entity must only be referred to as Sterling Holdings in his presence and in all his official paperwork. If he asked about the ownership structure, the Human Resources Department was to state the firm was managed by a private board of directors. I went further, ensuring the trap was flawless. I ordered Marcus to arrange the temporary removal of my portrait from the lower-level employee break room. I instructed building security to deactivate the digital executive directory screens in the specific maintenance wing where the interviews were held. Every possible trace of my existence was systematically scrubbed from the specific basement corridors where the night shift crew operated. I wanted him to walk into the building blind. I wanted him to feel profoundly grateful for the anonymous corporate giant feeding him scraps. I needed him to willingly sign his name on the employment contract before he ever saw my face. Marcus nodded slowly. He was a smart man. He sensed the immense gravity of the request without understanding the dark personal history behind it. He recognized a targeted maneuver when he saw one. He took the crinkled resume, tucked it into his leather portfolio, and left my office, closing the heavy oak door quietly behind him. I turned my leather chair to face the sprawling city skyline. The heavy rain clouds were finally breaking, allowing thin, sharp shafts of sunlight to strike the glass towers downtown. The trap was officially set. The bait was a steady hourly wage and a meager corporate benefits package. My father was desperate enough to swallow it whole without inspecting the hook. But the preliminary human resources screening was only the first procedural step. The true test of his broken pride would occur when he stepped through the revolving glass doors of my headquarters for his final interview. He was about to enter a world I built from the ground up, using the very stones he threw at me. He was about to sit in a pristine waiting room, surrounded by the immense, staggering wealth he always craved, possessing no clue that his discarded daughter held the master keys to the entire kingdom. The countdown to our inevitable collision had officially begun. I sat in the exact center of my penthouse office, staring at a sprawling grid of high-definition security monitors. The digital clock on my desk read 8:40. The heavy rain from yesterday had finally cleared, leaving the Chicago morning crisp and unforgiving. I tapped a few swift commands into my tablet, isolating the camera feeds covering the ground floor lobby of Sterling Holdings. The screen expanded, filling my vision with the sleek, polished expanse of Italian marble floors and towering frosted glass panels. I waited in perfect stillness. I was the architect, watching the trap snap shut. At exactly 8:45, the heavy revolving glass doors spun. A figure stepped out of the morning chill and into the climate-controlled sanctuary of my corporate headquarters. It was Thomas Aniston. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. The man on the screen barely resembled the domineering patriarch who used to terrorize my teenage years. He looked older. He looked broken. His posture, once rigid with unearned authority, was now deeply stooped. His shoulders slumped forward, as if bearing a physical, invisible weight. He wore a charcoal suit I instantly recognized. It was the identical suit he wore to his corporate logistics meetings a decade ago. But it no longer fit. The fabric hung loose on his shrinking frame, suggesting he had lost a significant amount of weight due to stress and poor nutrition. The trousers pooled awkwardly over his scuffed dress shoes. He clutched a cheap, worn, faux leather portfolio to his chest like a protective shield. He tilted his head back to look at the vaulted ceiling and the cascading crystal chandeliers. His eyes widened. He looked visibly intimidated by the staggering wealth surrounding him. Growing up, Thomas demanded pristine appearances. He enforced a strict dress code at our suburban dinner table. He routinely mocked service workers, claiming they lacked the discipline to wear a proper tie or shine their boots. He believed a man was defined by the sharpness of his lapel and the size of his paycheck. Now he stood in the epicenter of financial power, looking like a desperate imposter. The universe possesses a remarkable poetic symmetry. The man who worshipped status was now reduced to a mere speck inside a monument built by the daughter he discarded. I adjusted the audio feed on my control panel. High-sensitivity microphones embedded in the lobby architecture picked up the ambient noise. I watched him approach the reception desk. My front desk manager, a sharp professional named Chloe, greeted him with a polite, practiced smile. Thomas cleared his throat. I listened intently, waiting to hear the booming, arrogant voice that used to echo through our hallways. Instead, a meek, trembling tone emerged. "Good morning," he said, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. "I am here for the 10 o'clock custodial interview. My name is Thomas Aniston." Chloe typed his name into the system without missing a beat. She handed him a digital guest badge and directed him toward the plush waiting area. "Thank you, miss," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. He accepted the plastic badge with a shaking hand. There was no demand for special treatment. There was no attempt to charm the receptionist or assert his dominance over a younger employee. He was just another desperate applicant praying for a lifeline. He pinned the temporary badge to his lapel and walked over to a row of sleek leather chairs arranged near a cascading water feature. He took a seat on the very edge of the cushion, keeping his scuffed briefcase planted firmly on his knees. A younger man sitting 2 chairs down glanced over. The younger applicant looked to be in his early 20s, wearing a faded polo shirt and holding a folded paper application. The young man fidgeted nervously, twisting a pen between his fingers. He looked at Thomas, seeking a moment of solidarity in the high-stakes environment. "Beautiful building, is it not?" the young man whispered, leaning forward slightly. "I have never been inside a place this fancy. They say the company manages billions in commercial real estate." Thomas turned his head slowly. He looked at the younger applicant with hollow, exhausted eyes. He let out a long, ragged sigh. "It is a palace," he agreed, his voice laced with heavy, bitter regret. "The guy who owns this place must be a rare genius. I wish I possessed a fraction of his luck." The younger man nodded sympathetically. "It is tough out there right now. I just need something steady to pay my rent and keep the lights on." Thomas rubbed his temples with a trembling hand. "You are young," he said, his tone turning deeply reflective. "You have time to make the right choices. I spent my whole life chasing the wrong things. I bet on the wrong horse. I lost my shirt, my house, and my retirement. And now I am pushing 63, trying to secure a job, pushing a mop." I sat in my obsidian chair, frozen. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He actually admitted it. He sat in the lobby of a skyscraper, talking to a total stranger, and confessed he bet on the wrong horse. He was talking about Kyle. He was acknowledging the catastrophic failure of his blind loyalty. For 14 years, I waited to hear him admit he made a mistake. For 14 years, I craved a single shred of validation. Now I was hearing it through a hidden microphone transmitted from 50 floors below. A brief, dangerous wave of empathy washed over me. I saw a tired old man sitting on the edge of a leather seat. I saw a father who realized he ruined his own life. The vulnerability was raw and genuine. It was a stark departure from the rigid narcissist who threw a rusted shed key at my chest. But empathy is a dangerous emotion in the corporate world. Empathy tempts you to forget the blistering heat of the July sun. It tempts you to forget the unpaid tuition, the cruel insults, and the crushing weight of being the designated scapegoat. A moment of regret does not erase a lifetime of abuse. Admitting a mistake to a stranger does not repair the damage inflicted upon a daughter. He was not sorry for how he treated me. He was only sorry his chosen investment failed. He was grieving his lost wealth, not his lost child. I hardened my heart, pushing the fleeting empathy aside. I reminded myself I was the chief executive officer of a real estate empire. I did not operate a charity for men who squandered their family's future on a golden child who fled at the first sign of trouble. Thomas opened his scuffed briefcase and pulled out a pair of cheap reading glasses. He put them on and began reviewing his flimsy copied resume, tracing the lines of his past achievements with a shaking finger. He was trying to memorize his talking points, preparing to convince a hiring manager he was worthy of $18 an hour. He looked small. He looked defeated. He looked exactly like a man who was about to face the ultimate reckoning. The silver intercom on my polished desk buzzed. The sharp electronic sound sliced through the heavy silence of my penthouse office. A single flashing red light indicated an incoming priority call from the Human Resources Department. I reached out and pressed the button. My voice was cool, detached, and ready for war. "Yes, Marcus," I answered. The Human Resources Director spoke clearly through the speaker. "Ms. Aniston, the applicant is ready for the final round. I have completed the preliminary screening. He meets the physical requirements and his background check is clear. Shall I send him up to your floor?" I looked back at the security monitor. Thomas was taking off his glasses, placing them back into his pocket. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the interview that would decide his survival. He smoothed the lapels of his ill-fitting charcoal suit. He had no idea the elevator was about to transport him straight into the hands of his deepest regret. He believed he was going to meet an anonymous corporate manager. He believed he was going to beg for a custodial shift. "Send him up, Marcus," I said. I took my finger off the button. The game was over. The trap was springing shut. I stood up from my chair, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. I walked to the center of the office and waited for the heavy oak doors to open. "Send him up to the executive suite," I replied smoothly. My finger released the silver intercom button. The flashing red light extinguished, leaving the room in a state of quiet anticipation. The digital clock on my tablet shifted to 9 in the morning. The game of shadows was ending. The harsh fluorescent light of reality was about to flood the room. I stood up from my obsidian desk and smoothed the front of my tailored suit. I walked toward the sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sun pierced through the breaking Chicago clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported carpet. I needed a moment of profound stillness before the collision. I needed to center my breathing. Growing up, my father treated his suburban home office like an impenetrable fortress. It was a cramped, carpeted room filled with outdated logistics manuals and cheap plastic golf trophies. Yet he demanded total reverence whenever he occupied it. If my brother Kyle interrupted him to ask for gas money, Thomas would smile warmly, reach into his wallet, and ask about weekend party plans. If I dared to knock on the veneer door to ask for help with a geometry assignment, he would fling it open and glare at me. He looked at me as if I were a stray dog begging for unearned scraps. He would demand I stop wasting his valuable managerial time. He always claimed important men required unbroken concentration. Now the power dynamic was entirely inverted. He was no longer the king of a carpeted spare bedroom. He was riding a high-speed private elevator 50 stories into the sky. He was traveling to my fortress, a fortress constructed from imported stone structural steel and ruthless ambition. The faint melodic chime of the elevator echoed through the reception area outside my personal suite. The sound signaled his arrival. My pulse quickened a fraction, but I forced my heart rate to remain slow and measured. I walked back to my desk. I sat down in my high-backed leather executive chair. I rotated the seat 180 degrees. I faced the sprawling skyline, presenting my back to the heavy oak double doors. I folded my hands calmly in my lap and waited. The heavy brass handles turned with a solid metallic click. Sarah, my executive assistant, pushed the doors open. Her footsteps were light, crisp, and highly professional. Behind her came a different set of footsteps. They were slow, hesitant, and dragged slightly against the thick, plush carpet. They were the footsteps of a man walking toward a firing squad, hoping for a sudden pardon. "Mr. Aniston, the chief executive officer, will see you now," Sarah announced. Her tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for lingering. She stepped back into the reception area. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing the expansive room. Thomas stood near the threshold. The sheer scale of the penthouse seemed to swallow his shrinking frame. I did not move a single muscle. I remained facing the glass, watching his faint reflection in the window pane. I listened to his ragged, uneven breathing. He was trying to summon the courage to speak. Thomas spent 3 decades working in regional supply chain management. He routed delivery trucks and managed warehouse inventories. He wore stiff, starched shirts and acted as though he commanded global fleets. Whenever our family visited a restaurant, he treated the waitstaff with dripping condescension. He routinely snapped his fingers at bussers. He frequently stated that manual laborers were individuals who failed a basic intelligence test. He believed physical sweat was a direct symptom of mental deficiency. He judged human worth by job titles. Now he stood in a room worth more than his entire lifetime of earnings, preparing to beg for the very caste he spent his life despising. "Good morning, sir," Thomas began. His voice was laced with forced deference and a distinct tremor of deep anxiety. "I just want to express how profoundly grateful I am for this opportunity. I know my qualifications might seem unusual for this specific custodial role, but I assure you I am a highly dedicated worker." He assumed the person sitting in the chair was a man. He assumed the architect of this vast commercial empire had to be a powerful male executive. The patriarchal conditioning ran so deep in his veins, he could not even fathom an alternative reality. He was reciting a rehearsed speech to the back of a leather chair. I placed my hands on the smooth armrests. I dug my heels into the carpet. I swiveled the chair around in one fluid, sweeping motion. The leather creaked softly in the quiet room. I came face to face with my father for the first time in 14 long years. The silence that flooded the room was deafening. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that pressed heavily against the eardrums. The air grew instantly cold. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. The rehearsed words died in his throat. His mouth hung slightly open, revealing yellowed teeth. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, sickly ash hue. His eyes darted frantically around the room. He looked at the original abstract artwork hanging on the walls. He looked at the custom lighting fixtures. Then his gaze snapped back to the woman sitting behind the obsidian desk. He blinked rapidly and repeatedly, as if his brain actively rejected the visual information it was receiving. "Seraphina," he whispered. The name sounded foreign, brittle, and dry on his tongue. He took a stumbling half-step backward, his scuffed shoes catching on the carpet. His mind scrambled to find a logical explanation that fit his narrow, prejudiced worldview. "What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "Are you the secretary? Did the hiring manager let you use this office for the interview?" Even standing in the epicenter of my power, surrounded by undeniable proof of my success, his very first instinct was to diminish my presence. He assumed I was a low-level assistant borrowing a vacant room. He could not process a reality where the daughter he threw away held the reins to the kingdom. His fragile ego constructed an immediate, desperate defense mechanism to protect him from the stark truth. I did not offer a polite smile. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not boast or gloat about my achievements. I simply opened the top drawer of my desk. I reached inside and withdrew a single, thick cardstock rectangle. It featured matte black paper with raised gold foil lettering. I placed it on the polished obsidian surface. I extended my index finger and slid the card across the dark expanse. The heavy paper glided smoothly, stopping mere inches from the edge closest to where he stood. "Seraphina Aniston," I stated. My voice was perfectly level, chilled and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Aniston and Sterling Holdings. I watched his hollow eyes drop to the card. I watched him read the embossed gold letters. The physical reaction was instantaneous, profound, and devastating. The last remaining pillar of his pride snapped. His shoulders collapsed inward. The faux leather portfolio slipped from his trembling grip and hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud, spilling a few spare copies of his tragic resume onto the rug. "Take a seat, Mr. Aniston," I commanded. I gestured toward the sleek leather guest chair positioned opposite my desk. "We have a significant amount of ground to cover regarding your application for the night shift maintenance vacancy." He did not argue. He did not ask any further questions. He did not attempt to reassert his parental authority. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He fell into the guest chair like a marionette whose strings had been abruptly severed. The leather let out a sharp sigh as it absorbed his sudden, dead weight. He sat there staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He was a man waking up inside his own worst nightmare. The daughter he ridiculed, the girl he ordered to stick to dirt, was now his prospective employer. I picked up his crinkled paper resume and smoothed it flat on my desk. I picked up a silver pen and clicked it open. The time for silent observation concluded. The formal interview was about to commence. The sheer gravity of the moment settled over the room like a weighted blanket. Thomas gripped the armrests of the guest chair, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked like a man trapped in a descending elevator with no emergency brake. For years, he controlled the narrative. He dictated who held value and who was worthless. He funded Kyle and abandoned me based on a flawed metric of human worth. Now the metric had changed. The currency in this room was leverage, and I held every single coin. I looked at his trembling hands. Those were the same hands that tossed the rusted shed key at my chest. Those were the same hands that signed a second mortgage to fund a fraudulent tech startup. The poetic justice was almost too flawless to believe. I did not need to shout. I did not need to demand an apology. His current state of sheer pathetic terror was an apology written in physical form. "Are you ready to begin the interview, Thomas?" I asked, breaking the heavy silence. I deliberately used his first name, stripping away the title of father. Here in this building, he was merely an applicant. He was requisition number 409. He swallowed hard, his throat working to produce moisture. He managed a slow, jerky nod, unable to formulate a verbal response. The power shift was finalized. The ground beneath his feet had vanished into thin air. I looked down at his employment history, circling the wide blank space covering the last 7 years. The interrogation was ready to start, and I intended to ask every single difficult question he had spent his life avoiding. He stared at the small rectangle of black paper. The gold foil letters caught the morning sunlight, reflecting a harsh glare into his tired eyes. He reached out with a trembling hand and traced the embossed font. His fingertips lingered on the title, Chief Executive Officer. He looked up at me. The arrogant patriarch who spent decades dictating the terms of my existence was gone. In his place sat a terrified, hollow shell of a man. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. His brain struggled to bridge the impossible chasm between the girl he banished to the backyard and the woman controlling a staggering commercial real estate portfolio. "You own this," he finally choked out. His voice was a fragile, broken whisper. "All of it," I replied. My tone remained perfectly level and clinical. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not lean forward to ease his discomfort. I sat back in my tailored suit, observing him with the detached precision of an auditor examining a flawed ledger. I reached across the obsidian desk and pulled his thin manila file toward me. I flipped it open. The crisp sound of the paper turning echoed through the quiet penthouse. "I am reviewing your submitted resume, Thomas," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the printed page. "I see a significant gap in your employment history. You have not held a formal position in 7 years. Care to explain to your prospective employer why that is?" Hearing me use his first name caused him to physically flinch. The barrier of parental authority shattered into dust. He was no longer a father speaking to a daughter. He was an applicant begging for a lifeline. He swallowed hard. A thin bead of sweat formed near his graying hairline. "Seraphina, please," he started, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "You know exactly what happened to us. Kyle lost the seed money. The offshore fund went under. We have nothing left. The bank took the house. Your mother is unwell. We are living in a terrible neighborhood." I listened to his litany of excuses. He did not take a single ounce of personal responsibility. He blamed the offshore fund. He blamed the shifting economy. He even indirectly blamed Kyle, despite spending his entire life shielding my brother from accountability. As he spoke, a specific memory surfaced in my mind. I was 19 years old. I had just finished a grueling 14-hour landscaping shift in the blistering heat. I walked into the kitchen covered in dirt and sweat, holding an envelope containing my weekly cash earnings. Thomas sat at the kitchen table holding a calculator. He demanded I empty the envelope onto the table. He counted every single dollar bill. He took 30% for rent and another 15% for what he called an ambition tax. He told me I needed a harsh financial lesson because people who work with their hands are inherently irresponsible. He stripped away half my survival money with a smug, satisfied grin. Now the man who taxed my sweat sat in my office asking for unearned grace. He leaned forward in the leather guest chair. The initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a sudden, desperate shift in his demeanor. The ingrained entitlement of a former middle manager began to claw its way back to the surface. He looked around the sprawling office, taking in the sheer scale of the wealth I commanded. His eyes calculated the value of the custom furniture, the imported rugs, and the panoramic skyline view. Seraphina, if you built all of this, if you truly own this holding company, then you have to help us, he pleaded. His tone shifted from begging to a frantic, demanding pitch. Give me an executive role. Create a vice president title for me. I managed regional logistics for 3 decades. I know how to run a corporate team. You can put me in charge of your supply chain or facility operations. I am your father. You cannot leave me scrubbing floors when you have an entire skyscraper at your disposal. The sheer audacity of his request hung in the cold air. He possessed zero background in commercial real estate. He held no modern software certifications. He lacked a college degree relevant to high-level finance. His only recent financial maneuver involved falling for an obvious digital Ponzi scheme that resulted in the swift foreclosure of his primary residence. Yet he believed his biology entitled him to a corner office and a 6-figure salary. I looked at him in silence. I let his desperate demands echo and fade into the sterile quiet of the room. I watched the frantic hope flicker in his eyes. He genuinely believed the patriarchal bond would override my business acumen. He thought I would fold under the pressure of familial duty. I raised my hand and closed his manila folder. I brought the heavy cardboard cover down against the desk. The sharp cracking sound sliced through the tension like a physical blow. Thomas jumped in his seat. You are entirely unqualified to hold an executive role within this organization, I stated. My voice was stripped of any warmth, holding the sharp edge of a forged blade. His face flushed a deep crimson. But I have 30 years of management experience, he protested, gripping the armrests. I raised a family. I provided for you. You possess a documented track record of catastrophic financial mismanagement. I countered, cutting off his defense. You leveraged your primary residence to fund a fictitious tech startup lacking a single realistic revenue projection. You liquidated a secure corporate pension and wired the funds to an unregulated offshore entity without conducting a basic background check. You lost everything because you preferred a comfortable delusion over hard analytical truth. He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised my index finger, silencing him instantly. I run a highly profitable commercial real estate firm, Thomas. I manage complex portfolios for international investors who demand rigorous fiscal discipline. I do not operate a charity for men who gamble away their family security on golden children. The words struck him with devastating precision. He recoiled as if physically struck. The mention of his golden child drained the remaining fight from his posture. He knew my assessment was flawless. He knew he threw his entire life away chasing Kyle's hollow promises, while the daughter he discarded built an empire in the shadows. You told me to stick to dirt. I continued, keeping my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. You told me I lacked the intellect for high-level strategy. You mocked the blisters on my hands. You taxed my landscaping wages while buying your son luxury vehicles. You constructed a reality where I was destined to fail. Tears welled in his aged eyes and spilled over his wrinkled cheeks. He did not bother to wipe them away. The proud, stoic patriarch was weeping in the center of my office, shattered by the very daughter he deemed worthless. I am sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking into a ragged sob. I was wrong, Seraphina. I was so wrong. An apology delivered only when the speaker is stripped of all power holds very little value. It is merely a survival tactic. He was not crying because he realized the depth of his cruelty. He was crying because he realized the depth of his own profound mistake. He realized the bank he desperately needed was permanently closed to him. I opened the middle drawer of my obsidian desk. I reached inside and withdrew a single crisp sheet of white paper. The document featured the official corporate letterhead of Aniston and Sterling Holdings. It was a standard entry-level employment contract. The exact contract provided to night shift facility workers. "I am not giving you a vice president title," I said, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I will not grant you a corner office or an executive salary. You have not earned the right to make decisions for this company." I placed the single sheet of paper onto the dark surface of the desk. I smoothed the edges with my fingertips. "But I am hiring," I stated softly. Thomas looked down at the paper. His tear-streaked face twisted in confusion. He read the bold text printed at the top of the page. "Night shift custodian. Hourly compensation, $18. Before he could process the grueling reality of the contract sitting before him, a sudden, sharp noise disrupted the heavy atmosphere. The private security phone resting on the corner of my desk began to flash a bright, urgent red. The silent alarm indicated a severe disturbance occurring on the ground floor. The timing was uncanny. The past was not finished invading my fortress. Thomas looked at the flashing light, his confusion deepening. I reached for the receiver, my mind calculating the endless possibilities. The reckoning of his past words was paused, but a much more volatile storm was currently brewing in the lobby 50 stories below. The golden child was about to make his grand entrance, and the true test of my boundaries was only just beginning. The flashing red light on my private security console demanded immediate attention. The rhythmic pulse bathed the polished obsidian desk in an urgent crimson glow. The sudden illumination disrupted the tense quiet hovering between my father and me. I reached across the smooth surface and picked up the heavy receiver. The voice of my head of building security filtered through the secure, encrypted line. David spoke with the calm, trained precision of a military veteran accustomed to handling volatile threats. "Ms. Aniston, we have a developing situation unfolding in the main lobby," David reported. An individual identifying himself as Kyle Aniston bypassed the initial visitor screening protocols. He is currently shouting at the reception staff and demanding to see a Thomas Aniston. He claims it is a life-or-death family emergency. He appears highly agitated. "Shall I involve local law enforcement and have him escorted from the premises?" I looked across the desk at Thomas. The faint trace of color that had briefly returned to his aged cheeks vanished entirely. At the mere mention of his son's name, his posture curled inward. The formidable patriarch who once commanded dinner tables folded into a fragile shape of pure, unadulterated dread. Kyle had spent the last several months dodging furious creditors, changing phone numbers, and abandoning his parents to face the music alone. For him to suddenly appear in downtown Chicago meant his own desperate runway had finally run out of pavement. He was cornered. Growing up, Kyle treated every minor inconvenience as an earth-shattering crisis requiring immediate parental intervention. If he overdrew his checking account, he stormed into the kitchen throwing bank statements until Thomas wrote a check to cover the deficit. He learned very early that high volume and dramatic emotional outbursts yielded lucrative financial rewards. Now he was attempting to utilize those same juvenile tactics inside a sterile corporate skyscraper. He assumed his loud voice would intimidate my staff into submission. He severely underestimated the caliber of professionals I employed to guard my gates. "Do not call the police, David." I instructed, my tone smooth and tightly controlled. "Escort the individual into the private executive elevator. Send him directly to the penthouse suite. Do not release him until he is standing inside my office." I replaced the receiver onto the base. The click echoed in the large room. Thomas gripped the leather armrests of his guest chair. His knuckles turned stark white under the fluorescent lights. "Seraphina, please," he begged, his voice a thin, frail wheeze. "He cannot be here right now. He owes people money, dangerous people. He drained everything we had and ran away when the banks called. He is going to ruin this interview for me. Please, send him away." I stared at the terrified old man sitting before me. "Your golden child is here, Thomas. You spent a lifetime funding his existence while taxing my landscaping wages. You sacrificed our family home for his unproven ideas. It is only fitting he witnesses the final result of your investment strategy." The melodic chime of the private elevator pierced the thick silence of the executive suite. The heavy oak doors swung open. Kyle stumbled into the room, flanked by two towering security guards wearing crisp, tailored gray suits. The man who crossed the threshold bore little resemblance to the smug, polished college graduate who once sneered at my dirt-stained work boots. Kyle looked feral and untamed. His designer suit jacket, the same jacket purchased with my father's second mortgage, was stained and deeply wrinkled. Dark, exhausted circles shadowed his erratic, bloodshot eyes. He smelled of stale alcohol, unwashed hair, and sheer panic. He had hit rock bottom and was desperately searching for a new basement to exploit. He did not look at the custom abstract artwork adorning the walls or the panoramic skyline view stretching beyond the glass. His frantic gaze locked instantly onto Thomas, sitting in the guest chair. "Dad," Kyle shouted, his voice hoarse and raw. He tried to lunge forward, but the security guards planted their hands firmly on his shoulders, halting his momentum instantly. "I need cash right now. My accounts are frozen. The offshore guys are tracking my movements. They are threatening me. I tracked your phone location to this building. Get your signing bonus or your new paycheck or whatever you came here to collect, and let us go. We need to leave the city." Kyle spoke with the rapid-fire cadence of a cornered animal. He assumed his father had secured a lucrative executive position. He believed the wealth radiating from this building somehow belonged to his bloodline by mere proximity. He was so intensely focused on extracting emergency funds from Thomas, he had not yet glanced toward the person occupying the chief executive chair. I leaned back against the plush leather. I folded my hands, resting them deliberately on my lap. I cleared my throat. The single, quiet sound carried across the expansive room, drawing his attention like a magnetic force. Kyle shifted his erratic gaze. His bloodshot eyes landed squarely on my face. The frantic, nervous energy animating his limbs sputtered and died. He blinked repeatedly, trying to process the impossible visual data presented to him. He saw his sister, the disgraced landscaper, wearing a bespoke tailored suit, sitting behind an obsidian desk that cost more than his entire fraudulent software startup. Seraphina Kyle breathed, his jaw going slack. Deep, profound confusion contorted his features. "What are you doing sitting there? Where's the actual boss? Get out of that chair before you get Dad fired on his first day." I did not move. I did not offer a clarifying smile. I let the vast, echoing silence of the penthouse answer his absurd, uneducated questions. The two security guards released his shoulders and stepped back, maintaining a vigilant, defensive perimeter around the door. Thomas stared at the floor, unable to meet his son's gaze. The deep shame radiating from the older man was a tangible force in the room. Kyle Thomas whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of reality. "She is the boss. She owns the company." The words struck Kyle with the physical force of a speeding train. He stared at me. He looked around the sprawling office. He looked back at his broken, defeated father. The gears in his mind ground together, trying to reconcile his lifelong superiority complex with the undeniable, staggering evidence of my supremacy. His initial shock rapidly mutated into a familiar, ugly arrogance. The entitlement ran too deep in his veins to be erased by mere objective reality. If I possessed wealth, he reasoned, his twisted logic dictated, it automatically belonged to him as well. "You own this place?" Kyle scoffed, letting out a harsh, grating sound that grated against the quiet elegance of the room. He puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim his lost alpha status. "Well, that makes things a lot easier for everyone. You owe us, Seraphina. You let us drown while you sat up here hoarding cash. We lost the family house because you refused to help your own blood. I stood up. The slow, deliberate motion forced Kyle to take an involuntary step backward. I smoothed the lapels of my suit jacket. I walked around the edge of the dark desk, minimizing the physical distance separating us. The air grew thick with unspoken resentments and decades of history. I owe you nothing, I stated, my tone frigid and precise. You squandered $200,000 of home equity on a fictitious application that lacked a single line of code. You convinced your father to drain his corporate pension into an obvious digital scam. You orchestrated the financial ruin of your own parents and then fled to the coast to avoid the consequences. You are a parasite, Kyle. His face flushed a deep, furious crimson. We lost the house, he yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. The bank foreclosed on the only home we ever knew. You could have written a single check and saved it. You let strangers take our property. I walked to a discreet wall safe hidden behind a modern canvas painting. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying mechanical thud. I reached inside and retrieved a thick manila envelope. I turned around and walked back to the center of the room. I pulled a single legal document from the envelope. It was printed on heavy ivory paper, bearing the official embossed seal of the county clerk and the unmistakable signature of a bank executor. I held the document out, letting it catch the crisp morning light. Kyle stared at the paper, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Thomas lifted his head, his tired eyes tracing the bold black text printed at the very top of the page. You did not lose the house to strangers, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. I let the document slip from my fingertips. It fluttered through the air, landing softly on the polished glass surface of the coffee table separating us. I bought it. The legal document sat on the pristine glass coffee table, catching the ambient light of the penthouse. Kyle leaned forward, his breath hitching in his throat. His bloodshot eyes darted back and forth across the text. His brain struggled to process the complex legal jargon, but the final signature required no interpretation. The document featured thick ivory parchment bearing the official embossed seal of the county clerk. The bold black ink outlined the precise geographic coordinates of the suburban property. It listed the previous owners, Thomas and Helen Aniston. It detailed the foreclosure transfer. And at the very bottom, next to the signature of a senior bank executor, rested the name of the new sole proprietor, Seraphina Aniston. The lifelong delusion of his inherent superiority fractured right there on my office rug. He had spent his entire existence believing he was the destined heir to a prosperous kingdom. He assumed the universe existed solely to cater to his whims. Now, he stared at the physical, undeniable proof that his discarded sister possessed the very soil he used to walk upon. Growing up, Kyle never paid a single penalty for his mistakes. If he broke a neighbor's window playing baseball, Thomas purchased a replacement pane and offered a heartfelt apology on his behalf. If he failed a crucial midterm exam, Helen hired a costly private tutor to fix the grade. He was insulated from the harsh realities of consequence. Confronting an immovable boundary for the first time in his adult life caused his mind to short-circuit. The entitlement ran too deep to simply fade away. He straightened his posture, attempting to salvage a fragment of his shattered pride. "You bought our house," he stammered, his voice lacking its previous venom. "You own the colonial property, so you can just sign the deed back over to Dad. Or you can sell the lot and give me my share of the equity. I need a financial lifeline right now. Those offshore investors are threatening physical harm. You have to write me a check." I stared at him. The sheer, unbridled audacity was breathtaking. He stood in my corporate sanctuary, wearing a stained designer suit purchased with stolen funds, demanding a payout from an asset he helped destroy. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, chilling cadence of a judge delivering a final, unalterable verdict. There is no equity for you to claim, I stated, keeping my posture rigid and unyielding. You hold zero leverage in this negotiation. You are standing in my corporate headquarters looking at a deed that belongs exclusively to me. You will not see a single dime of my capital. You are not receiving a rescue package. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The primal panic of a cornered animal overtook his fragile composure. He lunged forward, reaching across the glass table, attempting to grab the lapels of my tailored suit. The two security guards reacted with lightning speed. They stepped between us, forming an impenetrable human wall. They grabbed his arms, pinning them tightly behind his back. Kyle thrashed against their grip, kicking his expensive Italian leather shoes against the thick imported carpet. "You owe me," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips, landing on the polished obsidian desk. "I am your brother. You cannot let those people find me. You have millions of dollars. Give me my share." "Security," I instructed, maintaining my steady gaze. "Escort this individual out of the penthouse suite. Escort him out of the main lobby. Do not allow him to collect any personal belongings. If he ever sets foot on any property owned by this holding firm, contact local law enforcement and have him arrested for criminal trespassing. Do not show him any leniency." They dragged him backward toward the exit. He hurled vile curses and empty threats. His frantic, desperate voice echoed down the private corridor as the guards hauled him through the threshold. The heavy oak doors swung shut with a definitive, solid click. The chaotic noise faded into a muffled, distant echo. The sterile quiet of the executive suite returned, settling over the room like a heavy velvet curtain. I turned my attention back to the leather guest chair. Thomas sat hunched over, staring blankly at the floor. He was openly weeping. Thick tears streamed down his wrinkled cheeks, dropping onto the lapels of his ill-fitting charcoal suit. He did not attempt to hide his face or wipe away the moisture. The pristine image of the stoic, flawless patriarch was gone forever. In its place remained a fractured old man, forced to witness the true parasitic nature of his favored son. For decades, Thomas defended Kyle's every misstep. He sacrificed his retirement, his dignity, and his primary residence to protect a boy who only knew how to extract resources. Watching Kyle demand money and then get physically ejected by security guards finally shattered the grand illusion. Thomas realized his golden investment was a hollow fraud. He realized he threw away his relationship with the only child who possessed genuine strength and resilience. The profound weight of that realization crushed the remaining air from his lungs. I walked around the desk and returned to my high-backed chair. I picked up the single sheet of crisp white paper I had placed there moments before the disruption. It was the standard employment agreement for night shift maintenance staff. I slid the document across the smooth, dark surface. The paper glided effortlessly, stopping right in front of his trembling hands. "You told me to mow lawns," I said softly, letting the words carry the heavy weight of 14 years. "You handed me a rusted key and told me to work with my hands. You instructed me to stick to dirt because you believed I lacked the mental capacity for high-level strategy. You mocked my calluses and taxed my wages." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk. "You were right about one thing, Thomas. Working in the dirt built my foundation. It taught me the value of leverage. It built this empire." I tapped the edge of the printed contract with my silver pen. "Now the roles are reversed. It is your turn to work with your hands. This is a contract for night shift maintenance. The compensation is $18 an hour. You will clock in at 10 in the evening. You will clock out at 6 in the morning. You will buff the marble floors and scrub the porcelain fixtures." He looked down at the paper. His chest heaved with quiet, ragged sobs. "You will report directly to the head custodian," I continued, ensuring every syllable landed with precise impact. "You will receive zero special treatment. You will not inform any of your coworkers about our biological connection. You are an entry-level employee, and if you ever refer to me as anything other than Ms. Aniston while inside this building, your employment will be terminated, effective immediately. Do you understand these conditions?" He reached out for the silver pen. His fingers shook so intensely, he struggled to press the top button. He looked at me one final time. His eyes held a mixture of deep sorrow, profound regret, and lingering terror. He knew this was his only lifeline. He knew the daughter he banished was the only person standing between him and total destitution. He lowered his head, pressing the dark ink to the signature line. The scratching sound of the pen filled the quiet room, sealing his fate and cementing my ultimate victory. 3 weeks passed since the ink dried on that entry-level custodial contract. The psychological shift inside the penthouse suite was profound and permanent. I did not celebrate with a lavish party or open a rare bottle of champagne. True power does not require an audience to validate its existence. Instead, I channeled that intense, focused energy directly into the expansion of my holding firm. I orchestrated the most ambitious commercial acquisition of my entire career. I was negotiating a $50 million purchase of a sprawling downtown high-rise, and the final signatures hinged on a late-night property tour. The international investment group flew in from Dubai earlier that afternoon. They were 3 men of immense, staggering wealth. They wore bespoke tailored suits cut from imported silk and wool. They moved with the effortless grace of individuals who owned entire city blocks. We finalized the financial terms over an exclusive private dinner, analyzing capitalization rates and municipal zoning permits. At 10:15 in the evening, I led them through the towering glass doors of my primary corporate headquarters to showcase the pristine standard of our facility management. The grand lobby of Aniston and Sterling Holdings was a monument to architectural precision. The vaulted ceiling stretched high above our heads, bathed in the warm, ambient glow of cascading crystal fixtures. The floor consisted of flawless Italian marble, reflecting the light like a dark, glassy lake. Our footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, a rhythmic click of designer leather heels striking polished stone. The lead investor, an astute older gentleman named Tariq, walked beside me, discussing the long-term structural integrity of the asset. I pointed out the modernized security checkpoints and the seamless integration of our climate control systems. I projected total, unflinching authority. As we approached the primary bank of elevators, a distinct sound cut through our refined conversation. It was the sharp squeak of rubber-soled shoes pivoting on wet stone. It was accompanied by the heavy slosh of industrial cleaning fluid inside a commercial yellow bucket. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a solitary figure working in the dim periphery of the grand atrium. It was a man wearing the standard-issue blue canvas maintenance uniform. He gripped the heavy wooden handle of a commercial mop, pushing the thick cotton strings across the pristine marble. His posture was deeply stooped. The physical exertion required to maneuver the waterlogged equipment was evident in the slow, deliberate strain of his movements. It was Thomas. Growing up, my father treated his weekend routines like royal mandates. He spent his Saturdays wearing pressed khaki trousers and crisp polo shirts, holding a titanium golf club. He viewed physical exertion as a punishment reserved for the uneducated lower class. If a waiter brought him a lukewarm coffee, he would loudly question the young man's intelligence. If a mechanic returned his vehicle with a smudge of grease on the steering wheel, he would demand a manager and threaten a lawsuit. He constructed an entire identity around the rigid belief that his white-collar job elevated him above the grime of the physical world. Now, the harsh fluorescent lighting of the service corridor illuminated his new reality. His graying hair was damp with sweat sticking to his forehead. The harsh chemical smell of industrial bleach clung to his uniform, replacing the expensive cologne he once treated as a daily necessity. He was focused intensely on a stubborn black scuff mark left behind by a careless delivery cart. He leaned his entire body weight onto the wooden handle, scrubbing the stone with grueling, repetitive force. The trio of wealthy investors glided right past him. They did not pause their conversation. They did not offer a polite smile or a brief nod of acknowledgement. To men who traded skyscrapers for sport, the individual holding the mop was merely an invisible utility. He was a human fixture designed to blend into the background, ensuring their path remained spotless and unobstructed. They looked right through him. I walked a few paces behind Tariq, keeping my pace slow and measured. As the spatial distance between Thomas and me narrowed, he suddenly ceased his labor. The rhythmic squeaking of the mop stopped. He leaned his weight against the heavy wooden pole, seeking a brief moment of physical respite. He lifted a trembling hand and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow using the rough fabric of his blue canvas sleeve. He slowly raised his head. His tired, hollow eyes scanned the small group of passing executives. Then his gaze locked onto me. 14 years ago, we stood in a cramped suburban kitchen. He looked down his nose at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He threw a rusted yellow shed key at my chest and told me my brain was defective. He banished me to the dirt while handing his favored son a golden ticket. Tonight, the spatial dynamics were entirely reversed. He looked up at me from the bottom of the deepest trench. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer that commanded instant respect. I walked shoulder to shoulder with global financial titans. I held the deed to the very ground beneath his aching feet. The tension in the air crystallized. I waited for a flicker of dormant resentment to spark in his eyes. I expected a lingering trace of that stubborn, toxic pride to curl his lip. I braced myself for the silent accusation of a defeated patriarch blaming his daughter for his own spectacular ruin. None of those things happened. The arrogance was gone. The delusion was permanently fractured. Thomas stared into my eyes and saw the immovable reality of his situation. He saw the empire I built in the shadows while he foolishly wagered his future on a parasitic son. The profound weight of his lifelong miscalculation settled heavily onto his tired shoulders. He stood up straight, forcing his aching spine into rigid alignment. He squared his shoulders beneath the cheap blue canvas uniform. He maintained unbroken eye contact. Then he dipped his chin forward. It was a small, deliberate motion. It was not a father looking down upon a disappointing child. It was a humble, undeniable nod of deep, profound respect. It was the gesture of a defeated man acknowledging the supreme authority of a boss who had rightfully earned her crown. He accepted his new station in life. He accepted his invisible status. He accepted my victory. I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride or interrupt the flow of the architectural tour. I simply lowered my chin a fraction of an inch, returning the subtle, silent acknowledgement. I received his surrender and logged it into the permanent ledger of my memory. I turned my attention back to Tariq, seamlessly resuming our discussion regarding the municipal tax incentives of the proposed acquisition. The elevator doors chimed and parted, sliding open to reveal a polished, mirrored interior. We stepped inside the plush cabin. As the metal doors began to slide shut, I caught one final glimpse of the ground floor lobby. Thomas was already bending back over his yellow bucket, plunging the heavy mop into the sudsy water, resuming his grueling nocturnal shift. The stainless steel doors sealed shut, cutting off the view. The elevator accelerated upward, pressing me gently into the floor. A profound wave of quiet, undeniable peace washed through my chest. It was not a loud, triumphant celebration. It lacked the screaming, dramatic vindication you see manufactured in cinematic movies. There were no explosive arguments or tearful confessions. The vengeance was a cold, sterile equation, balanced to absolute perfection. The man who ordered me to stick to dirt was now performing honest, grueling labor to keep my floors immaculate. The justice hummed with the steady, reliable rhythm of the building climate control system. I was finally truly free from his suffocating shadow. The toxic tether snapping provided an immense relief, but an ecosystem built on decades of denial does not die a quiet death. Thomas accepted his physical demotion, but he did not live in a vacuum. Every morning at 6 o'clock, he changed out of his damp blue uniform and boarded a city bus. He traveled back to the cramped, depressing apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. He returned to a woman who had spent her entire adult life curating an illusion of suburban superiority. Helen Aniston enabled every single cruel decision her husband ever made. She stirred her scrambled eggs while he threw that rusted key at my chest. She hired the expensive tutors to fix Kyle's failing grades. She nodded in silent agreement when Thomas mortgaged their future for a fraudulent tech startup. She crafted the pristine narrative that protected the golden child and isolated the scapegoat. Now she was forced to sit in a dingy living room, listening to the roar of a concrete recycling facility, watching her broken husband return home, smelling of industrial bleach and exhaustion. The fragile glass house she spent decades protecting was shattered beyond repair, and her favored son remained a fugitive, hiding from furious creditors. The crushing reality of her new poverty was inescapable. The quiet surrender of a defeated patriarch would inevitably trigger the frantic, desperate panic of a complicit matriarch. I knew the silence emanating from that bleak apartment would not last forever. Desperation breeds a unique brand of fierce, irrational entitlement. Helen was watching her entire universe collapse, and she knew exactly who possessed the vast resources to rebuild it. The illusion was dead, but the resulting debris was gathering momentum, preparing to crash directly onto my private executive phone line. The final confrontation with the architect of my childhood isolation was rapidly approaching. News of my father's new custodial position eventually infiltrated the cramped one-bedroom apartment on the industrial edge of the city. The undeniable truth shattered the fragile remaining pieces of my mother's fabricated reality. Helen Aniston spent her entire adult existence curating an illusion of suburban perfection. She was a woman who meticulously ironed cloth napkins, hosted neighborhood association meetings with a rigid, manicured smile, and turned a blind eye to my blistered hands. She ignored my grass-stained work boots because acknowledging my grueling manual labor contradicted her pristine narrative. She always preferred the comfortable lie of a successful, affluent family over the harsh truth of a deeply fractured one. When Thomas walked through the thin veneer door of their dingy apartment, wearing a standard-issue blue canvas uniform, her carefully constructed universe suffered its final, catastrophic collapse. He smelled of industrial bleach, heavy perspiration, and profound exhaustion. He was forced to explain the origin of the uniform. He had to confess that the anonymous corporate entity signing his meager paychecks was actually owned by the very daughter they discarded. He had to admit that Kyle, their visionary golden child, was permanently banned from the premises by professional security guards. The stark reality was inescapable. The kingdom belonged to the scapegoat, and the patriarch was sweeping the floors. The quiet surrender of a defeated husband inevitably triggered the frantic, desperate panic of a complicit wife. Helen could no longer hide behind the protective shield of my father's middle management salary. She could no longer pretend her favored son was a misunderstood genius. The illusion was dead, but the resulting emotional debris gathered fierce momentum, preparing to crash directly onto my private executive phone line. It happened on a crisp Thursday afternoon. I sat at my polished obsidian desk reviewing a complex series of municipal zoning permits for a new commercial development. The private, secure phone resting on the corner of my workspace began to flash a bright, urgent green. This specific line bypassed the standard reception filters. Only a handful of high-level executives and top-tier investors possessed the direct routing number. I glanced at the digital caller identification screen. The name displayed was Helen Aniston. She likely spent days scouring public corporate filings or interrogating distant relatives to unearth my direct contact information. My finger hovered over the receiver. For a fraction of a second, the ghost of a lonely, neglected teenager urged me to answer the call. The ghost wanted to hear an apology. The ghost wanted a mother to finally express genuine maternal pride. But the chief executive officer knew better. A woman who remained silent while her husband threw a rusted shed key at her daughter's chest does not call to offer sudden, unconditional love. She calls to demand a rescue package. I withdrew my hand. I watched the green light flash in steady, rhythmic pulses until the automated system redirected the incoming call straight to voicemail. 10 minutes later, I pressed the speaker icon on the console and listened to the digital audio file. The recording began with a sharp, trembling intake of breath. Helen was sobbing. It was not a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was a loud, theatrical wail designed to inflict maximum psychological guilt upon the listener. "Seraphina, how could you do this to us?" Helen cried, her voice echoing through the sterile quiet of my penthouse office. "How could you humiliate this family? Your father comes home every single morning with an aching back and blistered hands. He is a respected manager. He is a proud man. Making your own flesh and blood scrub toilets is cruel. You are being vindictive and heartless. We lost our home. Kyle is missing. You have millions of dollars and you choose to punish us? You need to fix this right now. You need to give him a real job and get us out of this terrible neighborhood." The audio file ended with a sharp, resonant click. I leaned back in my high-backed leather chair and let the profound silence of the room wash over me. I analyzed the contents of her hysterical message with the detached clinical precision of a forensic accountant examining a fraudulent ledger. Helen did not express an ounce of sorrow for the 14 years of emotional neglect I endured. She did not apologize for allowing my father to tax my landscaping wages to fund Kyle's luxury vehicle. She did not express regret for enabling the catastrophic financial decisions that left them bankrupt. Her tears were entirely selfish. She did not truly care about the physical pain in my father's aching back. She only cared about the deep social shame of being married to a janitor. She was mourning the loss of her unearned status. Her accusations of cruelty hung in the air, but they failed to penetrate my armor. I did not feel a single trace of vindictive guilt. I felt a chilling, impenetrable resolve. The undeniable truth is that offering Thomas that custodial contract was the most profound act of mercy I could have possibly extended. If I wanted to be truly cruel, I would have shredded his crinkled resume and instructed security to toss him onto the street. I would have let him face the brutal, unforgiving job market as an aging, bankrupt executive with zero modern tech skills. I would have let the collection agencies tear their remaining dignity to shreds. Instead, I provided a vital lifeline. I gave him a steady, reliable paycheck. I gave him an hourly wage of $18. I provided comprehensive corporate health insurance covering his medical and dental needs. I enrolled him in a matching retirement contribution plan to slowly replace the pension he foolishly wired to an offshore scam. I replaced his toxic gambling addiction with an honest, honorable living. I broke the generational cycle of financial delusion. I did not become a monster to defeat my abusers. I simply held up a flawless mirror and forced them to live inside the exact reality they actively created. I forced the man who told me to stick to dirt to earn his survival through the very manual labor he spent his life mocking. My assessment of the situation was thoroughly validated a few weeks later during a routine human resources briefing. Marcus, my meticulous director of personnel, entered my office holding a stack of quarterly performance reviews for the facility management staff. He slid a crisp, printed report across the obsidian desk, tapping a specific row of data with his pen. "I wanted to bring this particular file to your attention, Ms. Aniston," Marcus said, his tone conveying genuine professional surprise. "The candidate you flagged for the night shift maintenance crew, Thomas, he is turning out to be an exceptional hire." I raised an eyebrow, urging Marcus to continue. "According to the shift supervisor, Thomas is currently our most reliable custodian," Marcus explained. "He clocks in 15 minutes early every night. He routinely volunteers to cover weekend shifts when other team members call in sick. He never complains about the heavy physical workload." The supervisor noted his meticulous attention to detail regarding the executive washrooms and the marble lobby floors. He keeps his head down and follows every protocol to the letter. He is a model employee. I looked down at the performance metrics. The data confirmed the narrative. The grueling physical labor was slowly, systematically reconstructing his broken character. Stripped of his arrogant title and his unearned authority, Thomas was finally learning the fundamental value of an honest day's work. The sweat equity was burning away the suffocating layers of his narcissism. He was rebuilding his life with his own two hands, exactly as I had done 14 years prior. I thanked Marcus for the update and dismissed him from the suite. Life settled into a new, steady rhythm. I continued to expand the holding firm, acquiring new commercial assets and dominating the Chicago real estate market. The frantic voicemail from Helen remained an isolated incident. She eventually realized her theatrical demands held zero leverage over a daughter who no longer craved her toxic approval. The suburban illusion was permanently buried. Sometimes the demands of managing a sprawling corporate empire require late nights. I often find myself sitting in the penthouse suite long after the sun dips below the jagged city skyline. The towering skyscraper grows incredibly still. The bustling, chaotic energy of the daytime staff fades, leaving behind a serene, focused quiet. During those late solitary hours, the ambient city light filters through the floor-to-ceiling glass, casting long, elegant shadows across the imported carpet. I review complex structural blueprints and sign massive acquisition deeds. And occasionally, if the building is silent enough, I can hear a faint, distinct vibration echoing up the hollow elevator shafts. It is the low, steady, rhythmic hum of a heavy commercial floor buffer gliding across the marble tiles 50 stories below. The sound does not spark a sense of malicious victory. It provides a deep, profound sense of grounding. The distant mechanical hum serves as a constant, reliable reminder of my origins. It reminds me of the blistering July sun, the calloused hands, and the rusted yellow shed key. It reminds me of the exact moment I decided to stop fighting for a seat at a toxic table and chose instead to build my own impenetrable fortress. The hum of the floor buffer is the sound of absolute, undeniable justice. It is the sound of a father paying his debts in the shadows while his daughter commands the horizon. I listen to the faint vibration, close my leather portfolio, and prepare to finalize my journey. The empire is secure, the boundaries are drawn, and the ultimate lesson is ready to be shared. And that is my story. I know a significant segment of the audience listening to this narrative will hold strong, conflicting opinions regarding the final outcome. Some of you will argue I should have shredded that cheap, crinkled resume and allowed the man to face the harsh, unforgiving streets. You will say a father who hands his daughter a rusted shed key while financing a fraudulent tech startup for his favored son deserves to endure true destitution. You will claim true justice requires watching him lose every single comfort he spent his life hoarding. On the opposite end of the spectrum, others will insist I acted with a cold heart. The traditionalists will argue that family blood binds us to a higher moral standard. They will say I should have embraced him, wiped his slate clean, and offered him a comfortable corner office with a 6-figure salary simply because he is my biological father. They believe forgiveness requires a full restoration of unearned privileges. Both of those philosophies are fundamentally flawed. If I had chosen the path of total destruction and left him to starve, I would have allowed his historic cruelty to poison my own character. Vengeance is an exhausting, toxic emotion that binds you forever to the person who hurt you. It requires you to mirror the darkness you spent your entire life trying to escape. I did not spend 14 years building a pristine commercial real estate empire just to pollute my sanctuary with cheap, vindictive actions. Conversely, if I had granted him an executive title, I would have validated his deeply ingrained narcissism. I would have reinforced the exact delusion that ruined his life in the first place. Giving a man a corner office when he lacks the discipline to balance a basic checkbook is not an act of love. It is an act of sheer enabling. It tells the abuser that their toxic behavior carries zero lasting consequences. True boundaries exist in the quiet space between vengeance and enabling. True boundaries are about protecting your own hard-earned peace while simultaneously enforcing rigorous accountability. Offering Thomas an $18 an hour custodial contract was the perfect unyielding mirror. I provided a reliable paycheck, comprehensive health insurance, and a safe working environment. I gave him the fundamental tools required to survive the economic collapse he orchestrated. But I stripped away the hollow, arrogant titles. I removed the unearned status. I forced him to trade his profound entitlement for a mop and a bucket. He is finally learning the dignity of an honest day's work. The generational cycle of financial delusion stopped the exact moment he signed his name on the dotted line. If you are listening to this right now and you recognize your own reflection in my journey, I need you to pay very close attention. If you are the designated scapegoat of your family, you know exactly what the isolation feels like. You are the one they call slow. You are the one they mock at holiday dinner tables. You are the one they chronically underestimate. They dismiss your achievements and magnify your minor flaws to protect the fragile ego of the favored child. The instinct to fight back is incredibly powerful. The urge to scream your truth across the kitchen table is overwhelming. You want to present logical arguments and demand fair treatment. You want them to finally open their eyes and see your inherent worth. Do not waste your breath. Narcissists do not speak the language of logic, and they are entirely deaf to the language of empathy. They only understand the cold, hard currency of leverage. Arguing with a parent who has already decided your rank in their fabricated hierarchy is a useless endeavor. It drains your energy and provides them with the exact emotional reaction they crave. Take all that raw, stinging pain. Take every single bitter rejection. Take the unfair comparisons, the skipped birthdays, and the blatant favoritism. Gather every piece of that trauma and use it as fuel to construct your own fortress in the deep shadows. Let them laugh at your humble beginnings. Let them sneer at your rusted lawnmower, your dirt-stained boots, or your entry-level uniform. Let them pour their resources into the golden child who only knows how to consume. Maintain your strict silence. Save your capital. Study the mechanics of the real world while they remain trapped inside their suburban echo chamber. Outwork them while they are sleeping. The universe possesses a flawless balancing mechanism. The real world does not care about high school popularity or blind parental loyalty. The global economy demands tangible receipts. It tests every foundation. The golden child who coasts through life on unearned praise will eventually face a crisis that requires genuine resilience. Because they never develop the calluses required to survive a storm, their fragile structure will inevitably shatter. The foundation built on pure entitlement will always collapse under the pressure of reality. And when the dust from their spectacular downfall finally clears, you will be the one holding the deed to the property. You will be the one standing behind the obsidian desk, controlling the assets they desperately need to survive. You hold the power to dictate the final chapter of your own story. You do not owe your abusers a rescue boat when they are the ones who intentionally drilled holes in the hull. You have the fundamental right to walk away. You have the right to curate a life surrounded exclusively by individuals who celebrate your intellect and respect your strict boundaries. I found my peace in the quiet hum of a commercial floor buffer operating 50 stories below my penthouse office. The sound represents the harsh, beautiful reality of a universe correcting a long-standing error. Thomas is sweeping the floors of my empire, and I am looking out over a horizon that belongs entirely to me. I survived the backyard shed. I conquered the skyline. I know there are thousands of you currently sitting in your own version of that dark shed, wondering if the struggle will ever yield a tangible reward. I am the living proof that the long, silent game is always worth the grueling effort. If my journey resonated with your own experiences, please hit that like button and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. It helps the algorithm push these narratives to the individuals who need to hear them the most. I want to build a community of survivors who refuse to accept the false labels assigned to them. Share your own family survival accounts in the comments section down below. Tell me about the moment you realized you were the scapegoat, and tell me how you planned your escape. I read every single one of your entries. Your resilience inspires me to keep sharing these stark truths. Remember, the most effective response to a lifetime of doubt is not a shouting match. The best revenge is not revenge at all. It is vast, undeniable success. Keep building your empire. Until next time. Although being repeatedly marginalized, mocked, and dismissed as a worthless failure by the very parents who are supposed to protect and guide you can inflict profound, permanent emotional wounds. The ultimate lesson derived from this harrowing yet triumphant journey demonstrates that true power is never found in engaging in futile screaming matches or seeking immediate vindictive retaliation, but rather in the quiet, unrelenting discipline of channeling every ounce of that toxic rejection, blatant favoritism, and cruel underestimation into the unshakable foundation of your own undeniable empire. Furthermore, when the inevitable, spectacular collapse of the entitled golden child and the narcissistic abusers finally occurs due to their own catastrophic financial delusions and blind arrogance, leaving them utterly bankrupt, desperate, and knocking at the gates of the very kingdom you built in the shadows, you will discover that the most profound and satisfying victory does not emerge from exacting malicious vengeance, nor does it come from enabling their toxic behavior by restoring their unearned status and privileges out of a misplaced sense of biological obligation, but rather from establishing and enforcing strict, immovable boundaries that force them to face the harsh, unvarnished reality of their own destructive choices, thereby proving unequivocally that the absolute best revenge is massive, undeniable success, combined with the emotional maturity to offer them a strictly transactional lifeline, like a custodial mop and bucket, that systematically strips away their unearned arrogance while permanently preserving your own absolute peace and independence. And if this empowering message of overcoming family toxicity, reclaiming your shattered confidence, and building a magnificent fortress of success out of the heavy stones cruelly thrown at you has resonated with your own personal struggles, I strongly urge you to hit like, leave a comment sharing your survival story, and subscribe to the channel Sophia Told Stories.